right, well, good evening. My name is Todd Bizidlo. I'm principal here at Shrewsbury High School. And I want to thank you for joining me for tonight's webinar about how to talk to your teen about the death of a peer by suicide. Tonight, we've assembled members of our school community and crisis team to serve as panelists to help you process the tragic events of last week with your student. We will hope this will be an interactive session where you'd like to participate by using the question and answer box at the bottom of the page. I'd like to now take time to introduce our members of tonight's panel, which includes school psychologists, Dr. Mark Spisto and Michelle LeMay, our school adjustment counselor, Ms. Carrie Vokes, our assistant principals and grade administrators for the class of 2021, Jeff Lizotte, for the class of 2022, Mr. PJ O'Connell, the class of 2023, Mr. Greg Nevada, the class of 2024, Mrs. Maureen Monopoly, our Director of School Counseling, Mrs. Na Huen, our Clinical Coordinator for Transitions Program, Sue Donofrio, sorry, Sue, and our Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Joseph Sawyer. Thanks everyone for turning out. And I also want to welcome our special guest tonight, Dr. Larry Berkowitz, Director of Riverside Trauma Center. Dr. Berkowitz is a co-founder of Riverside Trauma Center. He's provided direct therapeutic services for over 20 years. His clinical areas of expertise include work with children, adolescents, adults, and families who are trauma survivors or suicide survivors. He coordinates and provides disaster response services, post-suicide intervention for individuals, schools, workplaces, and communities, and conducts trainings on suicide prevention. Dr. Berkowitz holds a doctoral degree in counseling and consulting psychology from Harvard University. He's a licensed psychologist in Massachusetts. He serves on the executive committee for the Massachusetts Coalition of Suicide Prevention, serves as the co-chair of the Northeast Massachusetts Coalition for Suicide Prevention, and holds an appointment as a teaching associate at Harvard's Medical School's Department of Psychiatry. Tomorrow, Dr. Berkowitz will be meeting with the Shrewsbury High School and Oak Middle School faculty and staff to help us process and cope with this loss and help give us guidance on how our community should continue to respond. So I'd like to turn it over to our guest tonight, Dr. Berkowitz, to introduce the topic and share his thoughts with us. Dr. Berkowitz.
Great, thank you, Todd. Thank you for that warm welcome. And good evening, everyone. I'd like to actually first start by just saying, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the loss to your community. And this is a difficult time for all of us to come together. And but good to see that so many of you are here to participate in the conversation. This is a hard kind of conversation to have with each other and with our kids. And I just want to start the evening by acknowledging that anytime we talk about a suicide loss, that's difficult. It's a challenge. Many of us have been impacted by suicide in our lives. All of you as a community are right now. And I just want to
Larry, your connection seems a little unstable. Mark, sorry about that. Mark Spisto, can you reach out to Larry and give him a heads up? Thank you. So we'll have our
difficult conversation and ask you to really pay attention to what your needs are. If you know, as we're talking, the conversation is just a quick word about who we are at Riverside.
All right, so Mark Spisto is our school psychologist. He is actually talking and trying to connect with Larry to bring him back. Looks like we had some connectivity problems. Larry, are you back with us? He's working on it, so just give us a minute. For those, and maybe Ms. LaRue is on this, the people that you're seeing on our screen serve as part of our school's crisis response team. And these are the people and the names that you will see who you need to reach out to in the event that your son or daughter or someone in your family is struggling here at school. So if you want to take a screenshot or capture their names and write them down, it's a good opportunity for you to do that. And please don't hesitate to reach out to any one of these individuals who can help provide some information and also provide services for you and your family and help direct you to the services you may need. Our community certainly has undergone a significant tragedy here, and my hope when Dr. Berkowitz will come back is share some of his expertise with us. So just give us 1 minute as we try and get Dr. Berkowitz back. And thank you for your patience. We certainly didn't plan on the technology snafu, so go ahead, Dr. Berkowitz.
Hi, folks. Any better this time around? Any better? You know what? Let's. Okay, so let me ask if you're able to hear me now.
We are.
You know what? I am also, if you'll excuse me, I'm so sorry about this. Why does this only happen when you're trying to? I'm going to move closer to my router. So if you will bear with me, folks. And we're all trying to figure out how to manage with the technology. I'm going to just move the computer and be back with you in about 30 seconds.
We'll certainly wait patiently. Our conversations with Dr. Berkowitz this past week has certainly helped inform our response to the community. And he's, as you can just by his credentials know, he's a wealth of knowledge and information. This is his specialty. So we certainly will wait for you, Larry, to get closer to some technology, and hopefully you can work these kinks out. I know we have a number of attendees there, so just please bear with us. There is a very worthy speaker, and it's a very important topic. So patience, please.
So my apologies. Let me try that again. Any better now?
It is. So okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry. This is a new world we're all trying to become accustomed to, isn't it?
No worries.
So again, I was starting to say, I'm sorry that we're all here together, and I'm sorry for the loss that you're experiencing as a community. I know this is difficult. Many of us are impacted by suicide in our lives. You're all impacted by a loss in your community right now. And I just wanted to say that these conversations can sometimes be difficult, and to really pay attention to taking care of yourself as we go through our conversation tonight. Certainly, you know, that your self-care is the most important part of our conversation. And you've got a whole group of really reliable and good people here, not only to take care of your children, but to help support you as needed too. Just a very brief word about Riverside Trauma Center. We are funded by the state through the Departments of Mental Health and the Department of Public Health Suicide Prevention Program to help schools, communities, agencies, workplaces respond to situations like this, as well as larger scale situations. We're actually currently running the state's FEMA funded COVID response program, crisis counseling program. So anything from large scale to situations like this that impact a community. So my hope for our time together tonight is to speak briefly about a little bit about what we know about loss and grieving and responding to losses, particularly for adolescents, and then to talk a little bit about suicide and how do we talk to our kids about that too. A little bit of that comes with understanding some things about suicide and thinking about ways in which some people, some parents, some communities have found it effective to have those difficult conversations with our kids. I also do want to start saying by, I really want to sort of thank the Wolfus family and acknowledge them for being so open and gracious. It's been a gift in some ways to the community in this tragedy that they are so open. Many families, sadly, are constrained by the stigma that often comes with talking about a difficult subject like suicide. And the fact that they can openly talk about it really helps us whenever we're talking with the community and when we're talking with young people about this difficult topic, because the best way to actually enter into conversations about suicide prevention is to be very direct about it. So credit and kudos to them for doing something so courageous in a very difficult time for them. So just wanted to start, so let's talk a little bit, but then we're going to open this up to some questions, and love to hear about what what thoughts you have, what questions you're hearing from your children, from the students, and also a little bit before we close today about some of the things you've done that you found useful and effective, conversations you've had that you think went well. That may be a great thing to share with other parents. So with your permission, if that sounds good, I'll jump into a couple of things. First is just how do we talk about or understand death when we're talking, especially talking with young people. Obviously, it probably makes sense to all of you that there's no one right way to grieve. We all grieve differently. Everyone has their own reactions. Some people will seem to turn inward, might be quiet, might shut down a little bit about it. Other people, it becomes big, and they're really stirred up about it, and will really be impacted in big ways. It's not uncommon for us to see maybe people who barely even knew Zoe to be having a really strong reaction. And that may just be because they're a more sensitive person, or in some way it's touching them or impacting them in other ways. We know anytime any of us are experiencing a death around us, or in our community, or in our social groups, in our families, it often reminds us of other losses that we've had. So for any of us as adults, or even our kids, if they've experienced other losses, you may be able to relate to this, right? It brings those other ones right back, and they come back into our heads and into our minds. So it wouldn't be surprising to hear connections, links, conversations about other losses too. Depending on the ages of your children, you may have younger children in your homes who are asking questions or wanting to know more about it. Understanding about death and talking about death is something we do, just trying to match the developmental understandings of our children. So for your high school students, yeah, you can talk about it in many of the same ways as we would talk about it with our peers, with other adults. For our middle school kids, they may become a little more disrupted and a little more anxious about even talking about death. May become more worried about, could something like this happen to my brothers or sisters or in our family? Much more the focus of what will happen to me if things like this happen around me. Sometimes we hear in middle school students. Younger kids may not even understand death. Certainly kindergarten, first, second, third graders don't understand the permanency of death in the way that we do as adults, or our older children do. So if younger kids are asking about it or have heard about it, we have to talk about it in very simple terms. About it's when our bodies stop working and our bodies shut down and our hearts and our brains stop working. One of the things we often talk about in our work at the trauma center is that a traumatic loss like this is often experienced in different domains. So we may all be aware of the emotional reactions to a loss and a death, the sadness, the numbness that might come with it. In these first few days, it's hard to even get our heads wrapped around this, to even understand how we're thinking about this and what it even means. The permanency of it is just too hard to grasp initially. So we have this range of emotional reactions. And actually, when we talk about a suicide death, there's a whole range of specific emotional reactions we experience. One of the universals after a suicide loss is for people to feel some guilt or blame. We start blaming ourselves. We worry about things we could have done or should have done. We have a colleague who refers to this as the tyranny of hindsight. I love that term, the tyranny of hindsight, where we look in the rearview mirror, we're sort of beating ourselves up for the things we should have seen. Did I miss this? The kids might be saying, I was going to text her, I was going to connect with her. Just yesterday we were talking, I should have done this, I should have known. And that kind of self-blame or blaming others is just one of the hallmarks of responding to a suicide loss, and is really challenging and hard. And I think often what we do is normalize that feeling, and to recognize it, and to not necessarily try to take it away too quickly, but to acknowledge that it may take time for us to give ourselves permission to understand we couldn't have known then what we know now, and that it probably made sense that we didn't make the call, that we didn't send that text, that we weren't doing those things. Sadly, it's after someone's gone that we put together all the puzzle pieces and figure things out in a way that we just couldn't have seen or wouldn't have known beforehand. So there's this range of emotional reactions, maybe even anger. You know, how could somebody do this to us, her friends, her community? And then we feel guilty because how can we be angry at somebody who is struggling? You know, we get tied up in knots with all the emotional things, often in the early stages. But it's not just emotions. So the emotional realm is one of the realms that we react in when there's a loss. There's also the cognitive realm. You know, for schools, they often tell us that students have trouble concentrating, that it's a little harder to get the homework done. I know your kids haven't quite started school yet, but there's a sense of distraction, of not being quite as connected and as sharp as we've been. Adults can feel this too. I think if you think back about some of the big stressors we've had, goodness, we've all probably experienced this around COVID over the last few months, that just being distracted, not being as sharp at work. There's this more what we refer to as this cognitive load on us. We're being stressed by so many things that it really impacts our ability to think clearly. And or we're thinking about it too much. You know, those quiet moments at night, we're laying in bed and the thoughts start coming up and we're kind of stuck in these loops of thinking about it and thinking about all the feelings and wondering about what was going on. So there's the emotional realm we see the cognitive realm. Sometimes we see what we refer to as a physical or a somatic realm. You know, when school's in session and in place, our school nurses see a lot of this, our students, after there's been a very stressful event like this. People will talk about having headaches, stomach aches, muscle aches, not sleeping well. For a lot of people, our reactions come out in our bodies. There was a well-known psychiatrist out of the Boston area, Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score about our reactions to trauma. And I really appreciate that title because so much of what happens after a really highly stressful event is it really ends up and lands in our bodies. So not surprising if you hear some physical complaints, you know, feeling sick to your stomach kind of things from our kids or the adults around us. So it's the emotional, it's the cognitive, it's the physical. Sometimes people will have spiritual reactions. You know, how could a just and reasonable God allow things like this to happen? Might be the questions. Or turning more towards their spirituality as a protective factor, as a comforting and soothing factor. For some of our adolescents, this becomes an existential question. You know, all these questions about life and death and what's the meaning of death. And these are actually, you know, sometimes good opportunities and moments just to have these general, broad, big world conversations with our adolescents. So it's the emotional, the physical, the cognitive, the spiritual, and sometimes too we talk about the relational or behavioral effects. You know, sometimes we'll notice our kids are feeling a little short-tempered, a little agitated or antsy. Now, that probably is true over the last 6 months. We've all been like that a little more so than usual, just because of the stress we've been dealing with in general. But not unusual to see some of those changes too. So I just wanted to put that out there, that there's this incredible range of reactions. A lot of this is normal and typical and not to be surprised as we see those things. Now, I've mostly addressed our reactions to any kind of sudden traumatic loss, but there's also the challenges of dealing with a loss by suicide. So just want to say a few words about what does that mean to us? What do we need to know about suicide? That could be helpful. Probably the most important thing to acknowledge or to say about understanding suicide is that there is never a single cause for suicide, and that's probably the most important take-home message. You know, oftentimes the media portrays suicide as attributable to something. Someone didn't get to college, somebody lost their job, they didn't get into, you know, somebody was, you know, fired from their job and killed themselves. It's never about a single factor. That's usually the tipping point, you know, that we see, but it's always multiple factors. It's always a perfect storm, if you will, of things coming together for somebody. Typically a bunch of underlying vulnerabilities, often that have been going on and building for some time, that with the addition of some particular stress factor might put someone beyond their ability to cope in that moment. So it's important to understand that and to know that, so that we're not blaming any one thing. And to know that there's an incredible range of risk factors too. We have over 60 known risk factors that have been studied and that seem to be connected to suicide. And yet no one of them we know would cause a suicide death. We do know that in many cases, research tells us, depending on the study, that anywhere from 50% or so of people who die by suicide, to one study said up to 90% of people have some underlying mental health challenge going on, some diagnosable mental health challenge. And one of the reasons I say that is because if we can know that that's going on and get attention for it and get some treatment, many of those conditions respond well to treatment. So it's important to know that. One of the questions that often comes up when we talk about a suicide death related to a student in a school is this narrative that maybe the school is putting too much pressure on our kids. Maybe the work has been too much. And the truth is, we really don't have evidence yet in the research that stress overall in general is a contributing factor to suicide. Stressors, like extreme stress, maybe, like to the point I made just a few moments ago about sort of a tipping point or something that moves someone beyond from thinking about suicide to acting on those thoughts. And we do know, in fact, that one of the things we've been seeing more and more among young people is this sense of this internalized perfectionism sometimes can be a risk factor and a contributing factor. But what's important to know about that, and we talk about a lot with schools, is what's stressful for one student is not necessarily for another. And for every student, for every kid, for all of us, there's this range of what we can handle for stress and what it means to us. And there's a sweet spot where we do well. Not enough stress in our lives, we don't do well. We kind of get bored or kind of rust out over time. Too much stress, we're overwhelmed and can't cope well and can't produce well, can't do our work well, can't do our schoolwork well. And for everyone, there's a zone somewhere in the middle, right? That's a sweet spot of how much motivates us and we can do well with. And that's different for everyone. And that's probably an important message, I think, at a time like this for our students and for ourselves, and thinking about how we talk about the issues about, what contributes. I don't know if that's particularly been a narrative here, but it's an issue I always like to bring up with schools when there's been a death of a student, because it's not surprising to hear people wondering about that. Could that be one of the contributing factors? Something always to look at, how can we as a community, how can we as a school community and as a town think about what are all the contributing factors, and what are the factors that contribute towards mental health and wellness, and how can we help promote those in a given community? So I'm laying out just a broad range of issues. A couple more I want to talk about, and then we'll get to your questions and your thoughts and your reactions. I think one of the biggest questions, though, is, so how do we talk about this with our kids? Sadly, I think for many of us as parents, we've got I don't know about you, I have a long list of things I worry about with my kids. It started when, they were in the crib, right? And we're looking in the crib and worrying, are they still breathing, from those first days on. And then there's, the list grows as our kids get older, and we worry about them driving and the drugs and alcohol and the social issues and all this whole long list. And now here's another one that now all of a sudden we're worried about, right? But in many of the ways that we have worried about those other things and think about them, and what we've learned is that we've got to talk about those issues with our kids. So this is sadly a teachable moment, and one where we want to be able to talk about it. So how do we do that? Well, probably starting with saying, especially for Zoe's friends, as parents and the adults around the friends, is to say, we're so sorry for your loss. And to really acknowledge they're just going through something really difficult. To let them know that we're there to listen and to talk, and to know that they may or may not want to. You know your kids best. You know when and where they'll talk. I don't know about you. For me, it always worked well in the car, right? We're driving somewhere, radio's on, we're looking forward, we're not looking at each other. The conversations could happen there. Maybe they're happening around the dinner table. Maybe they're happening because we're asking questions like, so what are you hearing from your friends? We're not going to ask them, so well, how are you feeling? But what are you hearing from your friends? What are your friends saying or talking about? This is a conversation not to have just once, but to also know that, in my experience, and I'd be interested to hear about you, I think our teenagers, many of them, they can't handle the strong emotions for as long as we can. And I think I've always found it best to talk just in little bits and little snippets about what's going on and what the reactions are and what are you thinking or feeling and what are you hearing from your friends. Follow their lead, and then we might have to talk about the Red Sox for a little bit, and then a little later we come back to it. Or we say something 5 minutes later, like, oh, boy, what you said before reminded me, and then you can get back to it, just in these little bits, little chunks at a time, and circle back to them again. But just like these conversations we've had about substance use and the dating issues and things, this shouldn't be a one-time conversation, a one and done. And we have to keep in mind a really important message, which is many people have worried that if we talk about suicide, it might plant an idea. That if we raise the question or ask about it, that we're going to get someone to think about it who's never thought about it. Well, the research actually tells us that's not at all true. That for young people who've not thought about suicide before, that anybody, adults or young people, that raising the question, if it's not something they've thought about, usually they'll be very honest with you and say, no, I haven't. And for people who actually have thought about it, if somebody raises the question, it gives them an opportunity then, gives them permission to talk about it in a way that's really relieving for many people, is what we've heard. Now, having said that, I also want to acknowledge one thing that you've probably heard, which is this worry or risk sometimes. We hear sometimes about the risk of what's called contagion, that exposure to suicide increases the risk of suicide. We know that is true for younger people, adolescents and young adults. When we use the term contagion, we're not talking about like the flu or the pandemic or things like that. It's not widespread. There's a very small increase in numbers sometimes. And the thinking goes that other people who might have been vulnerable to begin with, who might have had other vulnerabilities, now have seen this as something that somebody, I don't know, to put it roughly, it might become all of a sudden a tool in their toolbox, or there might be some increased permission for it. So what that leads me to is probably what I think as one of the next most important points, which is how do we talk about it? And I like to think about and talk about what I call changing the narrative around suicide. So when I'm talking to young people about a suicide loss, or when we're talking with personnel in schools, I often like to say that we want to tell our kids that we're really sorry about two things. One is that there have been two tragedies here. One is that they've lost a friend and a member of their community. And that's just really sad beyond words and beyond our comprehension right now. And the second tragedy here is that, whenever someone dies of suicide, is that we know somebody was suffering and was in crisis, and at that moment in time wasn't able to access help from other people. And that one of the messages we've got to get out to everyone in our community, as friends, as adults, to talking to our kids, talking to our students, is that nobody should ever feel like they have to suffer alone. That we've got each other's backs, and we've got to give permission for people to know that if they're struggling, it's okay to talk about these things. And I mentioned stigma at the beginning of my words, and that's so true when it comes to people struggling, mental health struggles or other struggles. If you talk to your kids about, if you say to them, so what would you do if you had a really bad headache, like you thought you were getting a migraine or something? They would talk to their parents. They'd go to the school nurse. You'd call the doctor, right? Same thing. You have an intense abdominal pain that won't go away for days. Of course, you're going to get someone to check it out for you, right? But what happens when people are feeling overwhelmingly depressed, or they're feeling so anxious that they feel like they can't cope? For some reason in our culture, we have this message that we can't talk about it, that we can't ask about it. And we've really got to start switching that message. And that's the work a community can start doing together, is really moving towards giving each other permission and knowing who are the people they can talk to. We want our kids to really talk with us about and know that there are trusted adults. They've got to have trusted adults at home and like in their home circles and in their school circles. And really ask them, if you were struggling and you really needed to talk to someone, I hope you will. I hope you'd come to me as your mom or dad or your primary caretaker. But if it's not me, who else? Do you have other people you could talk to? And really give our kids permission to know that it's okay to talk about those things. I've been talking too long. I promised you I wouldn't lecture, and here I have been doing just that. But I'd be interested in your reactions, your thoughts, your questions. I think Todd's going to moderate for us. What else do you need
Sure.
to do? What would be helpful? What are the reactions you're hearing or seeing from your kids? What's going to be helpful to the community?
So Larry, I have a few questions again, and I'll kind of move through these. First and foremost, I want to thank everyone for attending and the patients around the link. And thanks to Dr. Sawyer and Brian LaRue for getting that back out to people so they could join. And thanks for your patience around the tech stuff we had at the beginning. So two questions around peer groups, right? So there are peer groups where they have been connected in the past. Students were connected to Zoe maybe in elementary, middle school, and maybe their friendship has kind of waned a little bit in the sense of peers start growing apart. And when parents start to talk about this, they're clear, students are clearly being affected by it emotionally, and yet they refuse to talk with mom and dad about it. So it's impacting them. They refuse to talk about it. In fact, they get angry about it. So how do parents respect the boundaries of the teen idea of, I want to be independent, I can handle this, and yet parents are seeing like, this is a problem, we have to have a conversation about it. So what advice do you have for our parents around that, respecting boundaries and yet having the conversation when they're seeing their children are in pain?
Yeah, such an important and good question. And I think the way it's phrased actually is part of the answer, respecting boundaries and talking about it. I think you can do both. And I think you can do it in, again, little snippets. You can do it by saying, I know this is so hard. I know you may not want to talk about it. I just want to acknowledge, and you say a few words at a time. Maybe, we've been talking with the schools about, are there some ways to try to offer some groups, some small groups, whether we do that in Zoom or in person. Those are things that, we might be able to figure out together as a community, other ways to bring, because you're right. Often our young people want to be together with their peers to talk about this more than talking about it with the adults. So let's think together. Are there ways to do that in these days in ways that are, safe and respect social distancing?
So yeah, thanks for that, Larry. I think we've offered that to our community, and I think if people are listening now, we certainly can set up times where people can actually come into our building and meet with counselors. And if they're not comfortable coming in, we can set up a link like this for small private groups where our counselors can meet with students. And we certainly want to know and share with our students that we care about them. They're important, and everyone matters. And I think that's a key piece. Some of the messages that I sent today to the students and share with parents last night is like, we want to be connected with you. And the COVID pandemic has certainly created obstacles for us where we're not as in touch with the people in our community that we want to be as a result of being out of school. Mm-hmm. Given that, I think another question comes from the community is, I'm a member of the community, I'm a member of the class. My daughter or son is in this class of 2022, but we didn't know the family or the student personally. So what do we do to help support that? And the other question is, for those that aren't connected to them, some people don't feel that they have the right, for lack of a better word, to show emotion. So maybe you could address the emotion piece and then maybe thoughts on how to best support the family who's asked for privacy at this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are a number of ways of doing that. One is to acknowledge just that, the awkwardness, to acknowledge that anytime there's a loss in the community, it impacts all of us, even if we didn't know the person, especially for, I was going to say for young people, but it's true for adults too. We grieve. We are, as humans, we are social people. We have empathy for others. We imagine with great pain what this family must be going through. And it hurts us, right? We imagine what the close friends might be going through and the relatives and and right, from an empathic perspective, that it makes sense that we would be thinking those things. We all have rights to our feelings. There are not right or wrong feelings. I think that's important to acknowledge, to state. I think we can do things. Was it my understanding that some people are putting cards together and stuff and sending it to the school right now, collecting them and holding them, and maybe at some point the family will welcome those at a later point in time. These are good times for to let people, especially the younger people who did know Zoe, to reflect on who was she. We don't want to focus as much on the way in which she died, but more on how she lived. What do we know about her? What was she like? What was she like to her friends? It would be a nice moment to really hear, for those who did know her, recollections. That's a good way to honor somebody, is to hear what we know about them and to tell stories. The question is, how do we respect that we may not be close, but I think the message is we're all impacted, especially when we're part of a community, when we lose anyone in our community.
Thanks. The other question is, how do you respond to students who would say, who could be close or even on the periphery of Zoe's circle, when they tell their parents, like, she seems so happy to me, everything seemed normal and fine? How does a parent respond to that question?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and that's one that often happens, and one of the things that we often hear. And I think the answer is that many people are struggling inside, and they're holding on to things, and they're trying to put on a really good face. We often talk about, this sounds a little pejorative, it's not meant in this way anyway, in any way, as a sort of a duck face. If you look at a duck on the water, they look serene and calm and lovely, but underwater, their feet are paddling like crazy to keep them afloat and keep them moving, right? So there's often things we just don't see. And maybe there are a couple of people that know that struggle. And I think, again, it goes to something I was saying a little earlier, which is often we don't give ourselves and each other permission to share what's not perfect, to share when we're not okay. I wish we had, and we're starting to see it, more models in our communities. We're starting to see people like, our celebrities, Selena Gomez, talking about how she struggled with mental health challenges and has gone to rehab, and that has helped her. She's actually started a foundation to really focus on these kinds of things and to promote people sharing and getting help. Michael Phelps, arguably one of the greatest athletes of all times, has, if you look on YouTube, he's been talking out recently about his own struggles with depression and ADHD and substance use, and how getting help literally saved his life. We need more models of people in our communities saying, I struggled and I got help and I'm better, and that we can work these difficult things through.
So for parents who may see someone in their family or in their peer circle who have a student or a teen that's suffering from some form, looks like some form of just depression or anxiety or hopelessness, like, what should they be doing as parents?
Yeah, I think certainly asking questions, trying to open conversation, listening well. And if you're concerned, I would reach out, talk to your pediatrician, your primary care doc. We've got a whole group of people right here in front of you who are, skilled clinicians and who know your kids and know kids. They know adolescents and preteens and know how to talk with them. So if it's not you directly who can talk with them, please reach out to the folks in your school who are there to help as well. Maybe there are other trusted adults your kids could talk to, but I think the message is always to reach out and get support if you're worried. Again, that message, never worry alone, really. Talk to people.
It's a great point. And I think in our conversations at least at our freshman orientations in the last 17 years we've been here, at least since I've been here, is the conversations I have is we're experts in teens. We've had thousands and thousands of teens, and we've seen thousands and thousands of issues that many parents and families won't see in their lifetime. So we certainly serve as a resource for helping you as a community identify and deal with that and work to develop connections within our own community around mental health providers, or as Dr. Berkowitz said, connecting with your pediatrician to provide some supports. We have clinicians that are on this within Shrewsbury High School and throughout the school district that provide this level of support and actually know how the mental health care system works and can help people navigate that. Because that's a challenge for parents in and of itself, is learning how to do that. So I certainly would say that we are here to help and can help. We're not going to solve all the problems, but we certainly can partner with you in developing solutions and helping steer you in the right direction to get some real professional help outside of the school setting as well. The question is, another question from parents. Is there a difference between the way boys and girls express emotion and grief?
Any nods of heads from the counseling staff there on that one? I think as gross generalizations, yes. Can't say it across the board. Those of you who have sons at home probably know they may be a little more buttoned down about their emotional world, but not all, not all. This may be a great opportunity actually for dads to be talking to their sons, for dads to be modeling that this is a really difficult time, to be saying, gosh, this breaks my heart. This really makes me sad. I've been moved to tears about this loss, to really let our boys hear that we've got an emotional vocabulary ourselves, and that it's okay to talk about those things and to acknowledge it. But, you know, and it's always fascinating to me, I think, within a family. You know, you may have 4 girls and they all react differently, right? It's often amazing that they're all part of the same family, right? In the way they behave and react. But I think it's probably fair. I would enjoy any of the other folks who work with the kids in the school to respond to that one too. I think there's some stereotypical or characteristic differences. I don't know. Others want to comment on that?
We're going to pass for right now, Dr. Berkowitz. I have a question, and this is a real serious question, particularly for the for very, very close best friends in the kind of, I call it the inner circle of these of Zoe, and for any student who's faced this situation or any family who's faced this situation. What advice do you give the parents around how do you help kids who feel enormous guilt? How do you prevent them from feeling this guilt? Like, what strategies do you suggest to those families in particular? Because I think this is one that you talked about earlier, this enormous sense of what could I have done? What should I have done? I should have seen the signs. And I think anytime we're faced with a situation like that, or like this, those feelings are natural and normal. But what suggestions do you have for parents who want to talk to their kids about that?
Right. I think it's a natural instinct for us as parents to want to do whatever we can to take that away from our kids, to help them feel better. And I don't think that we can, in the short term, do that. We have to help them move through that, I think. And to normalize the reaction, to tell them we get it, we hear it. Of course you would feel that way. Of course you wanted to do anything you could to help your friend, and you would do anything now to get her back. And then have the conversations we were talking about. And I hope you'll see with some time that there's probably not much we could have done. There are probably things and everyone feels that way after we lose somebody to suicide. That's really one of the hallmarks. If there's anything that we're all asking why, and what else could I have done? Or did I miss something? And that why question, frankly, I mean, the only person who truly 100% knows the answer to the why question, sadly, is gone. So the rest of us are left wondering and hypothesizing and speculating. And I often say to people that the answers to those kinds of questions, we need to ask them until we get to a point where what matters more to us is what it meant to have her as a friend or a family member, and what it means for us to say goodbye and to move on to a different way of relating, to remembering and commemorating our friend and the person we cared so much about. It will take time. It will take time to move through that, and it's an unpleasant journey. But I think so. I think we do both. We acknowledge it. We keep saying, you couldn't have known. And here's a third part that I think is really important. I think this will become an important time to try to make meaning and to do something with this. If we can empower our students, our children, to start thinking about, so what can we do to honor our friend that we've lost, to honor the member of our community? And often that takes the form of, what can our community come together to do? Is that joining together to raise funds, in the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's Walk Out of Darkness, to raise funds for suicide prevention, to have a team? Is it about having an after-school club to look at mental health and wellness? Is it developing, bringing students together to really work on some project around how do we have each other's backs? There's a lot, and I'm sure you all have some ideas. I'll share with you ideas and connect you to other schools that have come up with some wonderful projects that students have really taken a role in trying to again, change the narrative about suicide, to take the energy they're feeling in this awful grief. And this is going to sound bizarre, but same colleague who talks about the tyranny of hindsight often will say to us, don't waste your grief. How can we take that grief and do something constructive and proactive with it? Having said that, I would like to, if I may, just make one other comment. One of the recommendations that we will give to the school and have given to the school, and this is sort of best practice in the aftermath of a suicide death, is to be careful not to have any permanent memorials in the school. So the plaques, the trees, the benches, after there's been a suicide death. And I'll tell you why in a moment. But that also means if we have this as a policy, that we need to do that, to be fair, after any kind of loss. So to have the same one. But here's the thinking and the reason. I mentioned the worry about contagion in the past. What we don't want to do is to romanticize in any way, to glorify in any way the method of death, that this is what someone turned to. What we do want to do is put the energy into those constructive, proactive things, to take the students' energy and to say, what can we do as a community? So let's build a fund together. Let's raise funds to have books for the school library or the town library on mental health and wellness. Let's come together. I understand Zoe had this wonderful kindness project. Is there something that the community can come together to do to honor that, and to come together and focus on, to commemorate her by remembering and focusing on what we as a community can do to come together. Those are the kinds of things that we would want to focus on.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think Mr. O'Connell has actually met with class officers from the class of 2022 and talked to other students within the class about something like that. So we're still working on that and trying to work out details. And I know that he met with people again today, a group of students today. So thanks for your feedback on that. Another question I have is I don't want to say a recurring thing, but a number of questions have come up, like, what do we do here in school? And for the community should know, in our grade 9 health curriculum, we offer a program called Signs of Suicide that all students go. There's a screening tool that we use, and then we actually process that screening tool and student responses through our student support team. Do you know about, Dr. Berkowitz, do you know about Signs of Suicide, that curricular program?
We've known about it for years, and this feels like a commercial, and I'm going to say this. We liked it so much we bought it. It's actually the program that developed Signs of Suicide merged into my agency, Riverside, 2 years ago, and they're part of the same division I'm in now. So we use it. We're very close to the program. It is one of the, in my opinion, one of the best evidence-based programs out there for suicide prevention. There are middle school, high school curricula, as you know. There's a senior booster for the program. Absolutely what you're talking about. We do, when school is in session in person, we absolutely, especially after a loss like this, not immediately, we need time to grieve, but a little further down the line, do recommend that kind of screening to try to help young people who are struggling have the opportunity to, talk about it and have adults connect with them about their experiences. So absolutely think it's an important program. Glad to hear you're doing it.
Thank you. A few questions have come up as well around social media, in terms of from parents, like, how do we protect our kids from social media influences on their concept of perfection and seem to be isolated, and everything seems to be fine, but everything's not really fine. And then kids using the comparison of what's happening on social media to compare each other of who's having the most fun or who's having that, and then makes that pain of isolation even harder. So do you have suggestions for parents around social media and how to manage that and navigate it with their teens?
So Todd, do we have till 10 o'clock? Wow, that's a tough one. And yeah, there's so much about this. We have really tried to look at that. We actually, a few years back, developed some focus groups with students who had been in schools where there had been, where they lost peers to suicide, and asked them about social media and how it had been used afterwards. I hear you talking about it in two ways. How do we think about it afterwards? How does it influence us or influence kids? You may be familiar with as parents with some of the research around it. And there's been some good evidence that the more time young people spend online on screens, not related to homework or doing work, that's actually a protective factor. But the more hours, the more likely they are to. So after 4 or 5 hours a day on average of screen time, we see increases in anxiety and depression and other concerns. So yeah, it is a concern, especially right now too, when kids have more time and whereby, often just because of out of necessity, we as parents can't be with them 24/7, but we should be having conversations with our kids about, social media literacy. What does it mean? What are you seeing there? What does it mean when you see, somebody got 500 likes for what they're doing, and really have the conversation. You would just implied it in the question, that what we see there is not all necessarily real, that it's giving us a skewed version of what's real in the world.
Right. A question I think that we haven't really answered, and I know this is somewhat of high school focused webinar, community webinar, but with the high school staff. But Zoe had a brother, and I think the question I have is, and it came in here from a parent, is what advice do we give the middle school parents and middle schoolers who don't want to be? How do they interact with the siblings? It's a question I think that probably many parents are asking themselves and wrestling with. So do you have any advice for our middle school parents? And I have to say that for those that are on the webinar, we have 311 people watching this. So this is truly something that is a community issue and something that people I feel want to know more about, learn more about. So I just saw the number, so I just wanted to share that with those that have stuck with us. We appreciate that. So the middle school piece, Larry, any help, any suggestions?
Absolutely, and what an important question. Thank you for that question. Yes, this is a moment where we want to talk to the middle schoolers about how do they interact with and talk with Zoe's brother. How do they help them to say when they see him next, "I'm so sorry about your sister," and not spend too much more time on that. For the school, hopefully the school counselors will talk with him before he comes back to school and help him think about what will be comfortable for him, help him practice what kinds of reactions, he might want to have. But yeah, I mean, this is about social skills. Sadly, we wish our kids wouldn't have to learn this until they were much older. But what do you say to someone who's just lost someone? Let's make sure that we're just as open in offering our condolences and saying, "Hey, buddy, we're here for you," as we would as if he had lost, a sibling to cancer or in a car accident or some other, equally tragic loss. So yeah, it's sad that we even have to be doing this with our young kids, but I think that the answer is to talk with them about how to talk to their friend. And again, I think all of us should be talking with our kids about how do we have each other's backs. And to the question about social media, some of that too is, what do you do if you see something online that worries you? What do you do if you see somebody saying, "Hey, maybe she had the right idea," or "I'll be with her soon"? We need to talk with kids about that's the perfect example of when you talk to a trusted adult. You got to tell your parents, you got to tell your school counselor. That's not ratting a friend out, that's saving a life. And then you got to talk about it.
A question again for parents dealing with parents. I think there is a stigma around mental illness, and there's stigmas around suicide in general. So how do we have our parents who interact with other parents suggestions for interacting appropriately with each other? Because some people have different opinions and viewpoints on suicide and thoughts about it. So do you have any suggestion for our parent community on how they can interact respectfully with one another given the circumstance and situation?
Yeah, I might need a little more specific examples of that, but
Sure. Yeah, I think you started to talk about this a little bit, Larry, in terms of when people are sick and there's a passing and there's a tragic accident, it feels like there's a surrounding of warmth and love and community. And when this happens, sometimes parents and families can be very isolated. This case is a little bit different with privacy.
Yep.
So I guess that's a struggle for some parents on how do you react to your peers when not necessarily the family group, but other that have strong opinions about it.
Yeah, right. Well, my default usually is to say, that you give support just in the same way you would around any other issue. If in the community of people who are suicide loss survivors or who have family members who may have survived attempts, even or who have been hospitalized for mental health issues, they often talk about how, if a family member had cancer or a broken leg or something, everybody would be stopping by with casseroles and bringing dinner and stuff. And when it's a mental health issue or an issue around suicide, there's all this silence. I think we really need to push through that. and really try to respond as supportively and warmly and as connectedly as possible for folks. You know, I also want to mention there are a lot of, I'm noting the time, and I'm glad to stick around for a little while, but I know all of you, I want to respect time too. There are a lot of great resources out there too. And, you know, I know the school has a number of them and have been putting them on websites and sending them out to you. I'll share some more with the school to put on your website and to send out, but lots of good places to look for resources on just some of the kinds of questions you're asking.
That's great. Well, we're approaching the hour, and I want to stay true to time. It's 7:29, and certainly we can, I appreciate everyone for turning out in terms of number of attendees. A couple things I want to close by saying. Tomorrow, Thursday from 12 to 3 and Friday from 12 to 3, we have school pictures here at the school, but we're also signing a memory scroll that we'll present to Zoe's family at a later date. So if your students want to come up to the high school and sign a memory scroll, they'll be outside the main entrance at the high school, and I sent the communication about that. I think that many of these questions that are in chat we will capture and reflect upon as our school community and provide some answers and maybe a Q&A later. We certainly have to continue this conversation. It's a conversation that we've been having for the last number of years, including this seminar, but also this webinar, but also internally in trying to adjust our expectations and trying to turn down the temperature on stress. So we need to continue those conversations. I think overall this is a good start. It's something that we need to continue. We will continue, and we are here for kids and we're here for families, and we want to provide that support. So I will send out tomorrow a series of resources from Dr. Berkowitz to all families so they can reference those resources, and any additional information I'll be certain to share with the community as well. I want to thank all our panelists for showing up tonight. If Mr. LaRue could put them all on the screen, these are all people in our community that are certainly willing and able to help your children. And if you have any issues, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're certainly here to help you raise your children in a sense. And we appreciate the huge audience we had tonight. I want to thank Dr. Berkowitz and everyone for turning out. Thank you all, and we'll be in touch soon. Be well.